welcome to the 21st episode of the Commander's Contingencies podcast. Today we are going to be talking about an Alela charge counters deck, a Riku jank garbage creature cards that name themselves deck, and aura mutation. We're going to analyze that card to see how many creatures we get on average and what the average CMC, well, not really the average, breakdowns of how much you're going to get each CMC. So to start off, there is no MTG news, and also I'm going to be working on some changes to this podcast. So because not that many people have been listening, and I don't really know how to learn how to be more entertaining. I think I'm going to look that up, but I'm not sure if that's the thing you can just take classes on and get better at. So I will try that. But another thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be putting the things that in my mind are the most valuable to every person listening to this. Every person that plays Commander wants to hear my analyzing of the cards because I've come up with some really valuable information from that and wants to hear the MTG news. So I'm going to start off with the analyzing of the cards, and then I'm going to go on to the MTG news from now and into the future. Then I will talk about the Commander Quest, and I will do those decks, because not everyone wants to hear about the Commander Quest, but I think everyone wants to know about the conclusions that I'm drawing. So, let's go ahead and do that. So, the card of the week this week is Aura Mutation. Aura Mutation is a white and a green for an instant. Destroy target enchantment. Create X 1/1 green sapling creature tokens, where X is the enchantment's converted mana cost. So, basically, what I am analyzing is how many saplings I'm likely to get, / what the odds are of me getting specific CMCs. So, what I did, I made this nice little chart where I have the CMC or more in each turn. So, CMC 2+ on turn 3, if you cast this, I am counting it as right before your turn on your last opponent's end step, you can cast it, so it would count for the entirety of all your opponent's turns. For turn 3, the odds of you getting a card with CMC 2 or more, and I eliminated cards with CMC 4, 5, 6, for example, because you wouldn't necessarily be able to play those on turn 3. If you ramp, you can, but I use on curve as a general baseline. So, with that, there is a 67% chance. On turn 4, there's an 83% chance, and on turn 5, there's a 90% chance. So that is 2 or more. So, really, it could be a lot more, could be just 2, but as a baseline for this card, that is quite good if you get 2. Because think about it, you're spending 2 mana at instant speed to create 2 1/1 green saplings. That is better than most other sapling token producers. And you get to get rid of an opponent's enchantment. And in a rare scenario, it could be a removal spell that could make it so you don't lose the game. It is quite good. And, when we increase these numbers, they're still fine. I actually expected this to be pretty bad, but it's not. I mean, last week I analyzed artifact mutation, and it is better, but aura mutation is also really good. Plus, I know when you're playing, you have noticed that if you compare the number of significant auras and the number of significant artifacts that you see across the field, think about it. Doubling season, for example, there's a lot more auras that are important and maybe even big. So, aura mutation is very good, even if it is not on the level of artifact mutation. And I can't really speak of how good it is as a removal spell. I can say that there's roughly 7.5 enchantments on average in commander decks. For those of you curious, I did a lot of analyzing, a lot of farming the data on EDHREC to find this. So this is just the average deck on EDHREC. There can be a lot of variation. Plus there's 3 opponents. I can't really, there's no mathematically sound way for me to scale up the number because of the fact that there are 3 opponents. At least not that I know of. But that the odds of it working are increased because of that. So if we're talking about winning 3 or more, on turn 3 we have a 44% chance, turn 4 we have a 71% chance, and on turn 5 we have an 80% chance. We're going to be wanting to cast this later rather than sooner. If your opponents have already cast an important aura or something big, go ahead, use it if you can't use your mana for anything else. And really, you just have to make your choice. But your odds are much higher if you wait. And that's the thing, you have to be careful because you can't take what I'm saying too literally. Because even if your odds are quote-unquote higher and you already hit the jackpot, you don't need to wait. If you have a solid opportunity to take it out and you know you're not going to have that opportunity again for a couple more turns, I would almost always take it out. That's just me, but just keep in mind, you might want to wait later, you might want to go sooner. Really up to you. You're the only one who has all the information while there. Okay, now CMC 4 or more. We have turn 4. We're starting on turn 4 because obviously you can't get anything on turn 3. We have a 45% chance. On turn 5, we have a 65% chance. And on turn 6, we have a 73% chance. So that is pretty nice. If we wait until turn 6, we are relatively likely to get an artifact with CMC 4 or more. What is... My cat just went under the couch. I'm not sure what he's doing, but that's strange. I'm just gonna let him do him. Okay, CMC 5 or more. This is when it gets relatively unlikely. On turn 5, we have a 32% chance. On turn 6, we have a 43% chance. And on turn 7, we have a 46% chance. Now, what I usually do with this data is I'll come up with an average. You have, for example, like an 80% chance to get this number or more. And when you do that, you'll have an average of those numbers of whatever number. But I don't think that's really a great way to represent it. When I say it like that, it's like I'm saying this is going to happen every time, and it's not. I don't want to represent my data in that way anymore because it distorts it and makes it much less accurate. So I'm only going to present you with the facts, and yes, that is a fact, but it is a fact that makes you think not quite accurate. I still don't know what my cat is doing. is being very strange. Okay. So this week there is no MTG news that I found really to be relevant. You could say there's some, maybe, but I didn't hear anything, really. I'm sure anyone could come up with something like, oh, this podcast released an episode that was controversial or something. But I usually only cover that type of thing if everyone else is talking about it, if it's a big talking point. Like if you remember when Mark Rosewater on his Drive to Work podcast talked about rules changes he would make. Everyone was talking about it, so I gave my opinion too. But other than that, usually I'm just going to talk about spoilers, things that are confirmed. Okay, so it is time to get into the decks. Alright, so real quick, I'm going to explain the Commander Quest. So the Commander Quest is my eventual goal in building all these decks. So I'm building like roughly 300 decks with no overlap in cards. So eventually I will have built decks with every single card in Magic that is legal in Commander. That is my eventual goal. That is what I'm working on, and that is what these decks are a part of. So if you're like, why isn't this card in there? It's because it's really limited, and I'm trying to balance these for this scenario. I'm not balancing them for play. I do when that's possible, and I do want them to be as close as possible to playable. So today we have two decks, and I'm going to start with the more janky and more fun, in my opinion, because, fun is completely opinionated, so I honestly probably shouldn't be saying it, but it's my podcast, I do what I want. Okay, so this is a Riku deck. So Riku of 2 reflections is 2 blue, red, green for a 2/2. Legendary creature, human wizard. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may pay blue, red. If you do, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. And whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay green, blue. If you do, put a token that's a copy of that creature onto the battlefield. So, the idea of this deck is to have preferably creatures, because they synergize with Riku much better, but also some instants and sorceries, because I can get them to synergize with the rest of the deck that have their name on them, and, well, with one exception, don't say you can run any number. So, one example of that is Accumulated Knowledge. 1. Blue. Instant. Draw a card. Then draw cards equal to the number of cards named Accumulated Knowledge in all graveyards. So, the idea of that is to get an Accumulated Knowledge into the graveyard while I have another on the stack, so I can get advantage. Now, the issue with this is, first of all, for instants or sorceries, it is extremely difficult to do this because of the stack. In order to copy this to copy an instant or sorcery in any situation, with only one exception that I found, with it still being in the graveyard, is impossible with one exception that I found. Well, actually, no, I didn't find it. Someone else found it. I posted it on a Discord server. Thank you. I don't remember your tag. So, basically, the way that I would benefit is if I had one in my graveyard while another was on the stack. And the reason that that's so difficult, and I can't just do it while it's cast, right? So what you would do in theory, even with Riku's ability, we'll use that. Or you could exchange Riku's ability with any fork effect, any effect to duplicate it. So what you do is you cast it, right? Then you cast the other spell or you use Riku's ability to copy it. Then, because of the stack, the copy will resolve, and then the accumulated knowledge will resolve. So it's very difficult to have accumulated knowledge in the graveyard while another is on the stack. The exception I was talking about is Spellweaver Volute. I don't know. Enchant instant card in a graveyard. Whenever you play a sorcery spell, copy the enchanted instant card. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. If you do, remove the enchanted card from the game and attach Spellweaver Volute to another instant card in a graveyard. So, you copy it. Then, the copy is on the stack. The copy is on the stack and resolves, and then it's exiled. And that is how that works. So it is really, really amazing. It is quite a good card. So that is the only exception that I found. It's possible there's others. So the idea of that, I have a lot of instants and sorceries that name themselves, and a couple of creatures. The creatures are much easier to synergize with. For example, Biovisionary, great win con in this deck. 1, green, blue, for a 2/3 creature, human wizard. At the beginning of the end step, if you control 4 or more creatures named Biovisionary, you win the game. So, basically, if I can make 4 copies, I win the game. Fairy Miscreant. Blue, for a 1/1 flying. When it enters the battlefield, if you control another creature named Fairy Miscreant, draw a card. That is the idea. So the way that I synergize with these is through clones. Clones are the namesake, basically have a similar effect to the namesake. Clone. Clone is 3 and a blue for 0/0. You may have Clone enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. So, I make copies of my things, and then I get benefit from having those copies. I have got 11 of similar effects to this. Notable ones would be Progenitor Mimic for green-blue for 0/0. It has the clone effect, and then it makes a copy of itself every single upkeep. That's just about all the notable ones. They have really the same effect. So, in terms of naming the self, the cards, there's not too many notable cards. They have very similar effects. I would have an exception for 7 Dwarves. So 7 Dwarves is 1 and a red for a 2/2. 7 Dwarves gets +1/+1 for each other creature named 7 Dwarves you control. A deck can have up to 7 cards named 7 Dwarves. Okay. So to start off, this is great because I can have lots of these. I have 7 of them. Second off, I make copies with my clones, which will make all the 7 dwarfs bigger. Third off, I just realized I'm gonna get really triggered and really confused because in the past, I didn't have any duplicates of cards, and now I will have 7, which is gonna trigger me. I'm now annoyed. So I'm gonna calm down, and it's a good card. I just should wait. I should have waited to break my no duplicates. I'm not sure if I said this before, but clearly if a card says it can have duplicates, then I'm going to not include that in my rule. Clearly, I don't know if I said that earlier, but that's what I'm doing. Although there is one asterisk on that, I can't say Shadowborn and Apostles, for example. I can't put any number of them in 2 different decks. I choose one deck, and then I can put the number or any number into one deck, into the one that I chose. So that's really that category, and that's what the deck is built around. There's a lot of supporting things. First of all, before we seem like we're moving on, we have a spy kit package. So spy kit is 2 for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has all names of non-legendary creature cards in addition to its name. So basically, the reason there's a spy kit package in here is there's 2 reasons. I don't know what the word is. I'm thinking of bifurcate, but that's just a magic card, so that's in this deck. So I think that's the wrong word, but it might be the right word. Who knows? Well, probably. There's probably like some listener just like being very angry and like knowing the word. Anyways, the reason there's a spy kit package in this deck is because these cards name themselves. So, if Spy Kit has the name of those, then it synergizes with those cards. Also, I needed a lot. I had basically 30 cards in this deck, and I was out of cards that synergized. So, I realized I had a Spy Kit, and I built a package around it. And I still had like 20 more to go, so I just added ramp, removal, and draw, which kind of sucks because they're staples. You'll see this deck has a lot of staples in it, which I don't love, but hopefully I'll be fine. I tried to be a little bit conservative, maybe. Basically, there's a lot of cards that synergize with Spy Kit, and I've got 2 other cards that can search for it out of my library, which, while admittedly, is not very much. I do have a decent amount of draw, like 4 cards, that I can duplicate, and a couple of different ways to filter through my library. Because I personally don't count cantrips as draw, or things that might, maybe if you're lucky, be considered draw, like Fairy Miscreant or Accumulated Knowledge. So, that is that. Also, there's other things I could definitely count as draw, like Spellweaver Volute, but I don't. And also, there's Coiling Oracle and Risen Reef, which could definitely be considered draw, but I just put them in ramp. So, I do have a lot of different ways to filter through my deck in order to try and find Spy Kit, but I would wager you're probably only going to get Spy Kit about half the time, which really sucks because there's a large chunk of your deck that is relying on you having it. So probably mulligan a lot, try and get it, but don't go too low, because your plan B works fine. Also, there are some ways to synergize with the rest of the Spy Kit package, even if you don't have Spy Kit. Okay, so that was kind of long rant. Basically, there are a lot of different cards that have crazy synergies with Spy Kit. For example, for each creature you control, you may search your library for a creature card with the same name as that creature. Put those cards into the battlefield, then shuffle your library. That is 5 in a green, so I just get any creature from my graveyard, from my library, into play. I probably would just grab Progenitor Mimic. There's a lot of different cards that synergize with it, but I'm going to choose one that is quite good. Bazaar of Wonders. 3 blue. when Bazaar of Wonders comes into play, remove all cards in all graveyards from the game. Whenever a spell is played, counter it if a card with the same name is in play or in a graveyard. So, your opponents can't cast creatures. Or they can't cast non-legendary creatures. Now, there's a lot of different cards in here. There's a 4-mana version of Double Enchant. There's a 2-mana pump everything by 2. There's a lot of different things that can work with it quite well. And it's just a good place to put all these cards. Alright, so to round out the deck, we have some synergy. So this is risky, and I wasn't sure whether or not to include it in the deck, but I decided, first of all, I need a lot more cards in this deck. I had a hard time finding enough cards that were janky enough to fill it in, which I kind of failed at. Second of all, it does synergize with Riku pretty well. Dual Nature is 4 green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature card comes into play, its controller puts a creature token into play that's a copy of that creature. And whenever a creature card leaves play, remove all tokens with the same name as that creature from the game. And when Dual Nature leaves play, remove all tokens created with it from the game. It happens to everyone. So it's just bad, but it works in this deck, sort of. Pardic Firecat. 3 and a red for a 2/3 haste. If Pardic Firecat is in a graveyard, Flame Burst's effect counts it as Flame Burst. That is my cat. He just bumped my microphone. Isn't that right? Okay, so basically, Flame Burst is one of the other cards that names itself. It is 1 in a red for an instant. Flame Burst deals X damage to target creature or player, where X is 2 plus the number of Flame Burst cards in all graveyards. It's just a way to synergize, and I don't think I could really make any good case for this going into any other deck. Plus, it's really bad, but it's fine. Okay. My cat just bumped my microphone again. Don't know why he can't go around it. That seems much easier, but I guess I'm not a cat, so I don't understand. Spellweaver Volute. 3 blue. Oh, I already read this, didn't I? It happens to the best of us. Twinning Staff. 3 for an artifact. If you would copy a spell 1 or more times, instead copy it that many times plus an additional time. You may choose new targets for the additional copy. And 7, tap, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So, your spell proliferate. It's just all this stuff over and over and over again. Same idea. So, there's not really much to say. I can point out some notable things with some notable cards that have charge counters on them. First of all, we have Darksteel Reactor, which is a good win con. 4 for an artifact. It's indestructible. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a charge counter on Darksteel Reactor, and when it has 20 or more charge counters on it, you win the game. So, yes, this is going to be less than 20 turns, but it's also still quite bad. Even if you have a Vidalcan Infuser, it's still 10 turns. Even if you have a Flux Channeler, it's still 10 turns most likely. It totally depends on how many cards you cast per turn. But it just isn't great. You need a win con, and this has good potential for it, but it's not great. There's also nowhere else that I could justify putting it, so that's another reason. We have Angel Heart Vial, I guess. 5 for an artifact. Whenever you're dealt damage, put that many charge counters on it. and 2 tap remove 4 charge counters on it to gain 2 and draw a card. Altar of Shadows, 7 for an artifact. Add black to your mana pool at the beginning of each main phase for each charge counter on it, and it has 7 tap, destroy target creature, then put a charge counter on it. It's quite expensive, but it works eventually once you've built up like an insane amount of charge counters on it. We've got an empowered auto generator. This deck is actually quite good at making a lot of mana. That's one of the many ways to get advantage. 4 for an artifact. It enters tapped, and you may tap it to put a charge counter on it and add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of charge counters on empowered auto generator. We have an energy chamber. This is just another thing that can add charge counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, choose 1, put a +1/+1 counter on target artifact creature, or put a charge counter on target non-creature artifact. Really, as I've said, there's not too much notable stuff. It's all along these same lines. There's Magistrate Scepter, which is 3 for an artifact, 4 tap, put a charge counter on it, and tap, remove 3 charge counters from Magistrate Scepter. Take an extra turn after this one. I mean, I'm just gonna stop talking about it there because it's all the same stuff. So you get the idea. 50 artifacts, tons of stuff. So that is the idea of the Alela Proliferate Charge Counters deck. It is time to get into the collection statistics. So first of all, as I said earlier, I will be forever triggered by these 7 dwarves. But I don't think there's a but, I'm just triggered, so not sure that's really not relevant, but I'm just gonna say it anyways. So there's 1,822 total cards, but really I've only gotten through 1,816. So we're moving along. We have 2264.38 is the estimated value, which if we go ahead and we get a calculator and we divide 2268 by 1816. I'm checking, okay? I'm doing maths. I want to see. Okay, so we have an average of 125 per card, which, as we calculated last time, it's overall for all Magic cards, it's an average of 2.24 cards, if not more. So we are much ahead by an entire dollar, basically. Okay, in terms of color distribution, we are not looking great. We have 130 multicolor, 232 white, 287 blue, 188 black, 312 red, 317 green, and 356 colorless. So, green, red, black, white, blue, black, red, green is the correct way to say it. Should all be even, and they're not. Red and green are sitting at 300, whereas the other ones are at like 250. So that's not great. And colorless, which has 350 cards, should be at like 250. Multicolor should also have more, should be at roughly 250, and it's at 130, so that's not great. We've got our type distribution: 1,044 creatures, 176 sorceries, 294 artifacts, 10 planeswalkers, 71 lands, 173 enchantments, 4 tribal cards, and 160 instants. So I don't know, I will probably next week I will have the data on the correct distribution percentages and how close I am to that. We will see, but I just remember in the past times that I have checked it, it has been fairly accurate. Okay. Terms of rarity distribution, we have 748 commons, 579 uncommons, 434 rares, and 61 mythics. So if we look at the actual distribution, there's slightly more commons than uncommons, slightly more uncommons than rares, and roughly 1/6 the number of mythics than there are rares. So I am on track, but really my slightly less is much more drastic, so I'm being much more lenient than they are. For example, I have basically double the number of commons to rares, and it's a difference of like 2/3 or 1/4 for each of them. Whereas for the other run, for the actual distribution, it's usually a difference of, I think it was like 1/8 or so, like 1,000. No, that would be 1/20th. So it's much more drastic for me. Actually, no. I'm not sure. I'd have to check, but it is much more drastic for me. I don't have any good way off the top of my head to say. Okay, so that is the end of the episode. Thanks for listening. You can find my personal archidekt at I'm a Johnny, AJOHNNY. You can find my Commander Quest, and with the link in the description below. You can find my Commander Quest account with the link in the description below, or at Commander Quest. You can see the link to my collection statistics in the description and my website. You can also visit my YouTube channel, Commander's Contingencies. Also, there's a link in the description below. I will also post any relevant links, such as the decks that I went over, or if there's any news, I will post links to my source or things that have more information. I will see you next week. Oh, there will also be time blocks to tell you what times certain things in the episode are happening.